County Board of Commissioners back to order. It is Tuesday, February 27th, 2018, and this is our afternoon session. And the first item of business this afternoon is item 12A, the second reading and public hearing on ordinance number 1801 in the matter of amending Chapter 9 of Lane Code to revise urban growth area recycling regulations. And we have Dan Hurley, our interim public works director, and Sarah Grimm, our waste reduction specialist here. And I'll turn it over to Dan to introduce the topic.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Board of Commissioners. I'm here to request your approval of changes to Lane Code Chapter 9. This is a result of legislation that was passed in 2015, Senate Bill 263, which modernized our recycling rules and added new requirements. So as a result, we need to make changes to our code to put new requirements on service providers within the urban growth boundaries of communities over 4,000. So essentially, these codes will have the haulers adopt the same rules that the cities that the urban growth boundaries surround will have to comply with. And there is a menu of requirements that the haulers can choose from. So the cities will pick which requirements that they want to implement in their city, and then the haulers will need to match that in the urban growth boundary area. And if the haulers would like to propose something different, we've put in language so that they can request a waiver to that and propose different requirements to implement the in satisfaction with the state law.
That's pretty much it.
Okay. Questions on that?
Any questions for staff before I open the public hearing? So with that, I will open the public hearing. Is there anybody signed up? Is there anyone that wants to address the board on this topic? Hearing none, I will close the public hearing, and we'll move on to deliberations by the board and possibly a motion. Commissioner Lyken.
So, Mr. Chair, I'd like, at this point in time, I'd like to move approval of ordinance number 1801, matter of amending Chapter 9 of the Lane Code to revise urban growth area recycling regulations.
Second.
So it's been moved by Commissioner Lyken, seconded by Commissioner Williams. Discussion to the motion. I will note that we did receive a email supporting this change in regulations from the folks at Bring. So that's the only communications I've gotten relative to this change is one note of support from an organization, I think, that knows what they're talking about. So that's all I will note. Is there any further discussion of the motion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, please. Oh, this is an ordinance. We need to do roll call. Mr. Mokowski, can you call the roll?
Commissioner Sorensen?
Aye.
Commissioner Lyken?
Aye.
Commissioner Williams?
Aye.
Commissioner Farr?
Aye.
Commissioner Bozevich?
Aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Very quick. So that moves us on to item 12B, the fourth reading and board final review and action of ordinance 1358 in the matter of amending the rural comprehensive plan to redesignate land from agricultural to marginal land and to rezone the land from exclusive farm use to marginal land with site review, adopting supplemental findings to address deficiencies of the county ordinance number PA 1317 as identified in the Land Use Board of Appeals remand, adopting savings and severability clauses, planning file 509 PA 1205208, and we have with us Deanna Wright. So I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, Chair and Board of Commissioners. For the record, I'm Deanna Wright, staff person for this file. The board did hear arguments during the public hearing in December 2012. The record was held open, and on January 23rd, 2018, the board met to deliberate on the matter. At deliberations, the board agreed to roll the decision to a fourth reading in order for staff to amend the ordinance and add a condition of approval limiting development to 3 dwellings within the 85-acre subject property, and to add the site review suffix to the ordinance. Staff is before you today to recommend that the submitted ordinance is approved under option 1 in your supplemental memo. This does conclude my staff report at this time. I'm able to answer any questions should the board have any. Thank you.
Any questions from the board? Commissioner Sorensen.
So as I recall, the board made a decision, and it was then appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals. And the Land Use Board of Appeals then remanded the decision back to the Board of Commissioners. Is that a
You're
fair
correct.
summary?
Yes.
Okay, now, why did the Land Use Board of Appeals remand it back to the Board of Commissioners?
In order for the applicant to amend the findings and supplement the record with additional findings to the big game habitat.
And was that done?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. And is there opposition to, now that the applicant has now put that additional information into the record, was there opposition to it, or was there agreement to it?
There was originally opposition, and then this settlement, a supposed settlement agreement occurred between the opposition and the applicant to reduce the impact to a total of 3 dwellings within the 85-acre property instead
What was
of
the original?
4.
4.
4 dwellings.
Okay. And is that, assuming that we go along with it, is that the end of the matter?
Let's hope.
What would be the reason it wouldn't be?
It's, I may have semantic concerns with the word settlement agreement. I don't think there's been a formal settlement agreement. That looks like there has been concession by the Land Watch folk that the maximum 3 homes, 2 new ones, is fine with them, and I don't anticipate them appealing. We haven't heard anything to that effect, but until the 21 days after this board's decision is up, we don't know for sure.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other further questions for staff? Mr. Lyken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to move approval of ordinance 1358. And this is in the matter of amending the rural comprehensive plan to redesignate land from agricultural to marginal land and rezone that land from exclusive farm use, E40, to marginal land, MLSR, with site review. And this is, of course, adopting the supplemental findings to address the deficiencies of County Ordinance Number PA 1317, as identified in the Land Use Board of Appeals remand of the county decision.
Second?
So it's been moved by Commissioner Lyken, seconded by Commissioner Williams. Any discussion to the motion?
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Lyken.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to compliment staff.
Thank you. Thank you.
This was tough.
Yeah.
And thank you for really hard work on this between yourself and Andy. Thank you so much for working on, and you're right. I like your comment. We hope so. So, but the fact that there seems to be some concessions and some sort of agreements in place, at least a handshake at this point in time. But I really want to say this was a heavy lift, and I want to compliment you and say thank you very much for the work.
Any further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, I'll call for the roll.
Commissioner Sorensen?
Aye.
Commissioner Lyken?
Aye?
Commissioner Williams?
Aye.
Commissioner Farr?
Aye.
Commissioner Bozievich.
Aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. So that'll move us on to item C, which is Order 1802-27, and I don't have a number on that one, 2707, sorry, 2706. I want to make sure I get the right number. In the matter of electing whether or not to hear an appeal of a hearings official decision denying a preliminary partition on a property identified as assessor's map and tax lot 18010000 1500, file number 509 PA 1705297. And again, we have Deanna Wright.
Good afternoon, Chair and Board of Commissioners. In the matter before you currently, the board is being asked to elect whether or not to conduct an on-the-record hearing for an appeal of a hearings official decision denying a preliminary partition. The subject property is a 48-acre property where the applicant proposes to divide the property into 2 parcels, each to contain an existing dwelling on the property in the F1 forest zone. Division is commonly referred to as a pre-existing dwelling division. In general, the appellant believes the hearings official exceeded his authority and misinterpreted lane code, state law, and other applicable law. The central issue in the hearing's official appeal proceeding concerned compliance with Lane Code 16.210, Section 9E, which allows a division of a property if at least 2 dwellings existed on the property prior to November 4th, 1993. The hearing's official found that the manufactured home is not lawfully placed and reversed the director's approval. There is currently a stick-built dwelling and a manufactured home on the property. Staff believed the manufactured dwelling lawfully existed on the property because subsequent to its placement, several land use and building permits were approved locally, which allowed the manufactured dwelling to be replaced. However, the record shows that the manufactured home was originally placed as a temporary mobile home, but was granted permanent status by a building inspector who had no code authority to do so. Since no code authority was granted, under the then existing zoning, the only way the manufactured home could have achieved permanent status was to obtain a conditional use permit. After research, no conditional use permit was ever obtained or requested. So even though the mobile home received several placement permits thereafter, these administrative permits never changed the legal status of the manufactured home because none of the permits were noticed as land use decisions prior to 1993 deadline. Therefore, based on the hearing's official justification, staff agrees with his interpretation and conclusion on the manufactured home. Because of this conclusion, there is no option to approve the pre-existing dwelling division. Lane Code Chapter 14.600 subsection 3 establishes the procedures and criteria applicable to the board's decision to hear or not hear the appeal on the record. The director does not find that the criteria to elect to hear apply, and neither has the director or hearings official recommended review by the board. Therefore, for these reasons, the planning director recommends motion option 1 as described in the memorandum, and the board elect to not conduct an on-the-record hearing for the appeal, and that the board adopt the hearing's official decision and remain silent on interpretations of ORS 215.780 made by the hearings official in the decision. We recommended remain silent because as a matter of state law, LUBA would normally have the authority to rule on state law matters. If it gets appealed, then we presume LUBA would rule on those interpretations. This does include my presentation. I can address any questions that the board may have on this matter. Excuse me, thank you.
Questions for staff? And is this one where we're past the 150 days
Yes.
anyway?
It is,
So the electing to hear is really a moot point.
correct.
Quick question, option 1 also affirms that hearings officials' interpretations of county code, correct?
Yes.
So what exactly, how much of this decision was based on the ORS versus the county code, that we're affirming his decision on? Is it the legality of the actual original permanent manufactured dwelling decision was done not correctly under county code? So is that part of the interpretation that
Yes.
okay, which seemed pretty straightforward reading the full report, that he's accurate probably in that interpretation. So going with option 1 sounds like we're affirming that portion, but as far as any state law or any legal precedent set by the courts, we're remaining silent there. So any other questions for staff? So with that, I'll look for a motion. Commissioner Lykin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to move approval of order 18-02-27-06 in the matter of electing not to hear and to remain silent on an appeal of a hearing's official decision denying a preliminary petition on property identified as assessor's map and tax lot 180100001500.
Second.
So it's been moved by Commissioner Lykin, seconded by Commissioner Williams. Any discussion to the motion? Seeing and hearing none, this is just an order, so I'll just call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Deanna. So that'll move us on to item 12D, which is Order 1802-2707, in the matter of electing whether or not to hear an appeal of a hearings official decision approving a dwelling in the impacted forest land F2 zone on Assessor's Map and Tax Lot 1701-2100-110 pursuant to the template dwelling provisions of Lane Code 16-211-5 and 8, file number 509 PA 17-05553, and we have Raphael Seba. So, Raphael.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. This is an elect to hear for an appeal of a hearings official approval of a forest dwelling, the so-called template dwelling, according to Lane Codes 16-2115 and 8. The central issue in this appeal relates to the matter in which subdivision, the Whistlepunk subdivision, was created between the years of 1983 and 1987. This affects the template, the number of parcels that are within the so-called template count that can be considered to qualify the subject property for a dwelling. The hearings official's findings contain a detailed chronology explaining the creation of the parcels within the Whistlepunk subdivision, including the subject property. The hearings official has reviewed the appeal and has found that the allegations of error have been adequately addressed in his decision and do not warrant reconsideration. The appellant has specifically requested that the board not conduct a hearing on the appeal and deem the hearings official decision the final decision. This application, with regards to the 150-day timelines, we are at day 221, so the board cannot hear this appeal within that timeline. The planning director, the hearings official, has not recommended that the board hear the application. The hearings official hasn't recommended that the board hear it, and the planning director has recommended that the board adopt the hearings official's decision as the final county decision and expressly agree with and adopt the interpretations of Lane Code 16-211. That concludes my presentation, if you have any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? Mr. Lykin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to move approval of Order 18-02-27-07, the matter of electing to not hear an appeal of a hearings official decision approving a dwelling in the impacted forest lands F2 zone on Assessor's Map and Tax Lot 1701-2100-00110 pursuant to the template dwelling provisions of Lane Code.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Lykin, seconded by Commissioner Williams to approve the order. Discussion to the motion. Seeing and hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Raphael. So now we go on to your next item, which is item 12E, Order 1802-2708, in the matter of electing whether or not to hear an appeal of a hearings official decision approving a legal lot verification and notice of one legal lot comprised of Assessor's Map and Tax Lots 2101, 3000, 1602, and 1607, file number 509 PA 17-05487, and I'll turn it over to you, Raphael, for the report.
Thank you. Yet another elect to hear today. This is an appeal of a legal lot verification in which the applicant had two tax lots, and the planning director found that together those two tax lots only comprised one legal lot, and the hearings official agreed with that assessment. The central issues in this case, in this appeal, relate to ownership of the property And also, the appellant has challenged the hearings official's findings related to established case law in which LUBA determined that there is no law that forbids the creation of split zoning. The hearings official has reviewed this appeal and believes that the allegations of error are adequately addressed. The appellant, again, has requested that the board not hear the decision, nor has the planning director recommended that the board hear the decision. The recommendation is that the board agree with the hearings official's decision and adopt it as the final decision. One thing that differentiates this from other legal lot verifications is that the issues are not so much a matter of reviewing all of the deeds, and it's not that there's an abundance of deeds that were reviewed. It's more whether or not you can create a split-zoned property. And as I stated earlier, the hearings official cited LUBA case law in determining that there isn't any law prohibiting the creation of a split-zone parcel. So the board expressly agreeing with any interpretations of Lane Code stands apart from the hearings official's reading of case law at LUBA.
Thank you for that distinction on that. Any questions for staff? If not, I'll entertain a motion. Commissioner Lykin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to move approval of Order 1802-2708 in the matter of electing not to hear an appeal of a hearings official decision approving a legal lot verification and notice for one legal lot comprised of assessor's map, tax lots 2101, 30, 00, 01602, and 01607.
Second?
Been moved by Commissioner Lykin, seconded by Commissioner Williams. Any discussion to the motion? Seeing and hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Which moves us on to item 12F, which is a first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance number 1802 in the matter of amending chapters 10, 13, 14, and 16 to amend and update references in Lane Code chapters 10, 13, and 16 and adopt severability clause, and looking to set that second reading and public hearing for March 13th at 1:30 time certain. So I will turn this over to Amber.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners. As you are aware, as part of the code modernization project, staff have been working on modernization of Lane Code Chapter 14, which is our submittal and it provides our submittal and processing requirements for land use applications and appeals. Today, staff requests that the board conduct a first reading on Ordinance 1802 and set the second reading and public hearing for March 13th, 2018 at time certain 1:30 p.m. Here in Harris Hall. Staff look forward to returning at that time to provide a full staff report, an overview of the proposed draft, and major changes that are proposed.
Any questions for staff? The one thing I'm hearing back, at least from the Planning Commission hearing, is a division of what was pure modernization based on matching up with state law versus what was suggested by the consultant that was assisting us in the modernization, that was discretionary, and understanding with the discretionary changes separate from the mandated changes in state law. That'll be helpful for the board as we talk about decision-making.
And
Sorry, Chair, Board, Commissioners, I'll just jump in because I was at the Planning Commission meeting when that issue was discussed, and that the feedback that we've heard on that front is specific to the Chapter 16 code amendments for the farm and forest land zones, and I don't believe we've heard similar comments like that related to the Chapter 14 updates.
Maybe maybe I'm confusing the two here.
It's all part of the same project that we're up to, so there's a lot of things in the works.
There are some Lane Code Chapter 16 amendments as part of this package.
That's
However, those
references.
are just limited to references to Chapter 14.
Great.
You should note there are some policy decisions being made or not made in the Chapter 14 updates that we can talk about as well. It's not just housekeeping stuff.
Yeah, great. Looking forward to that more extended discussion. So any other questions for staff? If not, I will entertain a motion for the first reading. Commissioner Lykin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to move approval of the first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing on ordinance number 1802. And this is to be from March 13th, 2018, 1:30. You want a time certain on that?
Yes, please.
Okay, time certain. And, all right.
Second?
So it's been moved by Commissioner Lykin, seconded by Commissioner Williams. Any discussion to the motion? Seeing and hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. Which brings us down to item 12G, which is a discussion item to give direction on fee and lane code changes related to elect not to hear appeals process. And we have Lydia here, and looks like we're going to get some help too. So I'll turn it over to Lydia.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners. As stated, we are here, this is the third time we're here to discuss the appeals, really the process that we've been using for appeals and the fees that are associated with that. So as was demonstrated this afternoon quite well, where you just received, I think it was 4 elect not to hear, and I think the LUBA remand was probably also processed that way. We have had a spike in appeals over the past couple of years, and we've provided some data regarding that spike, and specifically with regards to this elect not to hear. So what we covered in the cover memo is the board had asked us to return with some data about what happens to those decisions once they go from the board choosing not to hear them and they go straight to LUBA in that instance. I've updated the numbers from what was provided in the packet. We actually received another decision that was affirmed yesterday. So in about the last 13 months, we've had now 12 decisions that have been heard by LUBA. 6 of them were affirmed. 2 of them were withdrawn at the appellant's request. 2 of them were remanded, and 3 were remanded, and then there were 2 that were reversed. And I named the cases in the staff report. I don't know if it's in the board's interest, if you want to have some information about what the actual dispensation was, but if you want us to talk about that, Kira and I can cover that. You know, what the real issue for the division and for people who have brought this before the board is here is that these elect not to hear appeals are the second appeal that are heard at the county. State law mandates that the first appeal be capped at a $250 appeal fee. There is no such cap for the second appeal. Other counties, other cities have generally much higher fees for those appealed because most of us try to do some cost recovery. In about 2008, the board made a decision to lower the previous elect not to hear appeal fee from about $2,000 to $250. And that's really the challenge of the issue here is we are not trying to discourage anybody from appealing applications. You know, we try to work with applicants and appellants before we get to the appeals process. Sometimes we're able to do that, sometimes we're not. But regardless, the staff cost just to come before the board, prepare an application, prepare findings, and come before you significantly exceeds $250. And so the question that has been posed to us and actually to the board and then back to us is, you know, to what extent do we want to, continue, the word has been used, to subsidize the appeal fees. And so in the staff report, we made 3 recommendations. The third being, I'll just go backwards for fun. The third being that we don't make any changes changes, that we continue with our current process, which is we come before you, we keep that fee artificially low. The second two options kind of have a combination approach. When the board made the decision to change the fee, to reduce it to $250, part of the assumption at that time was that these would come before the board on a consent calendar, and that does save a little bit of staff time. It saves us from driving down Delta Highway. Usually we bring a couple of us so we'll be able to, answer your questions. So the other two options recommend that the board go back to that approach, that we would still provide findings, but that it would be heard on consent, and you would, as you do, review the consent calendar items. There's always the option for the board to pull something from consent, and then we would come before you. That usually happens a week prior. But that would reduce the fees, the cost of processing the application. And then the question is, do you want to change the fees associated with processing them? Certainly if we receive direction to change those fees, we'll do a little bit of public outreach. I know there's some groups that are specifically interested in this, and we bring that feedback back to you. We would also bring, of course, any fee changes through the Finance and Audit Committee. So the two recommendations are either changing the fee to $950 and to keep it on the consent calendar, or if the board wants us to continue to come before you, not have it a consent calendar item, then we would raise that appeal fee. You could raise that back up to $2,000, which is more in line with what the actual staff costs are. So that was kind of a very quick overview. I don't know if Keir has anything to add.
I just add one point to clarify regarding option one. If these appeals were to go onto the consent calendar, we've been working with county council on an option for the board to retain deference on decisions that are made where the board is construing or interpreting lane code. That's one of the concerns about having these pass right through the county and go directly to LUBA, that we would potentially lose that deference. But if there can be some discussion of the merits of the interpretation in the board report that comes before the board, and that can be approved or ratified through an order as part of the consent calendar, then our understanding is that the commissioners could retain deference on those matters.
So, questions or staff and discussion? Commissioner Lykin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Lydia, the question I have is how does Lane County compare to other counties? Do you have information on that?
Yeah, we did previously do some outreach to the other planning directors, and we are the only county that we could find that has a fee that is this low. The other fees are, like I said, they're around $2,000. In some cases, $4,000 or $5,000. So we are unique in that way.
And then the appeal of a director's decision, is there any comparison to other counties on the number of appeals? Would you have that by any chance? Or I'm not suggesting all 35 counties, but say counties that are somewhat similar to Lane.
Well, I think when we pulled those numbers before, we did do, again, some outreach to the other planning departments. And in my recollection, we're right up there, as it were. So I would say we have a larger than usual number of appeals. I think we have to keep in mind that compared with some of the smaller counties or counties that don't have the same development pressure, I mean, that's certainly part of the issue here. But yes, the number of appeals in Lane County, I think, is unusually high. I don't know if legal counsel has thoughts.
I don't have any empirical data. I have my sense from being around the land use world and appeals for a while and working at a few different counties and talking with other county attorneys. As you're aware, most of the appeals we get come via Landwatch Lane County. The sort of a percentage of appeals that happen in other counties seems to depend on how active the watchdog groups are there. And Landwatch Lane County is very active, and hence I think we have a greater proportion of appeals in other counties than most of the other counties, I think. There are some other ones that are very active. Deschutes County, I know, has a very active Landwatch group, so that's part of the issue going on.
Well, and I just, my opinion, I don't think anybody should be surprised by the amount that we have. I mean, honestly, I feel the pressures are there to look at development outside of the cities. I mean, if you think about it, I was in my second term as mayor. I love to bring this up. My second term as mayor when we split the urban growth boundary. House Bill 3337, that vote was in 2007. Envision Eugene was just adopted in 1 decade later. And so you have the pressures of trying to, you have these comprehensive plans, these plans being developed by cities, and the pressures are, well, people still want to move here. They want to live here. They want to buy land here. Where are they going to build? And so then you get the pressures put on counties. Then all of a sudden, the NIMBYs, lack of a better word, come in, and so I think the pressures are there. I think that's unfortunate. I guess the other question I have is, I wasn't on this board in 2008, so I'm trying to figure out why would you go backwards when if you index for inflation, that would actually go higher. So does anybody have historical reasons why that occurred? Because I'm curious why that would have occurred in the first place.
Well, there was a different composition on the board at that time, and I wasn't here at the county in 2008 either. I was in another city.
Yeah.
But my understanding is there actually was some pressure from the land use watchdog group to reduce the cost of filing appeals. Is that correct?
My recollection as well.
That's correct. I mean, Steve Voorhees was primarily engaged, but I sort of sat with him through most of those meetings where we talked about this. And that was, I mean, it was an understood point that lowering the fees would enable more appeals and easier and cheaper appeals. It wasn't going to be pure cost recovery anymore, but I think it was seen by the board at the time as a reasonable means to ensure accuracy of decisions in the county. And that's really the push and pull here. Is it a cost recovery thing? Is there a big need to have this sort of watchdog over looking at? So.
Well, first blush, and I'll look forward to discussion. So I support the idea of consent calendar. I think that actually makes sense because that relieves pressure from you, Lydia, and your staff to come over here and take away from the work you're doing there. So, I mean, I would support that. And you're right. If the board wishes to pull something off that can be done and then notify you, and then you can be here for staff presentation. But I think that's a first blush. That's actually a step. But what I would be interested in is bringing forth, so we have it before us, on how much other counties, especially like counties, what their fee schedule is. And I think there's one thing that I believe in, and that's been pretty consistent. And, I felt that way for as long as I've been in office. And so I think consistency would be very helpful, and especially with those counties that are around us. I mean, as we mentioned earlier during our strategic planning conversation, I mean, when we talk about regional economic development, it's not just Lane County. I think of regional economic development as Lane, Lynn, Benton, potentially Douglas, but these three counties in particular. And at the same time, when it makes sense that there's some consistency going on between counties that are just separated by, you're just either on I-5 or you're just separated just like that. And so that's my thoughts right now. Look forward to the discussion. So thank you for the presentation and the information.
One note, just so you'll have context when you see whatever numbers are, is most counties, I think, do it the way Lane County is in terms of their appeals, that being that the final word comes to the Board of Commissioners. There are a number of big counties, Clackamas and Washington, who don't go through the board at all for their appeals. They stop at the HO. We kicked that around a little bit. Staff generally felt that when you do that, you don't end up with the possibility of getting deference at LUBA, because it's not the enactors of the code interpreting the code, it's the hearings official. And so there's no built-in deference to that decision. That was felt to be worthwhile to maintain, that you can't do that when the HO makes the final decision. So the numbers may, in terms of how many appeals and what they cost, may be affected by the local procedures those counties have.
I was sure Sherman County thinks Lane County is a big county. So I think we fall into that. We're not that far behind Clackamas County as far as population is concerned. So I would say we would classify as a big county, and with Marion right behind us. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Ford.
Thank you. Just a question about pressure to develop. You say that other counties don't have the same pressure to develop that Lane County has. Are we talking about the big, giant counties with no people east of the Cascades?
Well, in part, certainly, but if you, I mean, I think the pressure to develop comes around urbanized areas. So the Eugene Springfield area has pressure to develop. Portland area obviously has pressure to develop. Albany,
And the
Salem.
pressure comes from people moving into the area, or let's say Willamette High School graduated 338 students last year, and if they don't want to live with their mom and dad, there's a little bit of pressure to develop there too, I think.
Right, and then, like you mentioned, in those eastern counties, you don't have the same concentration of population.
Because inside of Eugene, we have Willamette, Sheldon, North, South, Marist, all graduating, probably an average of 300. Every one of those people wants someplace to live, needs someplace to live, and most of their parents would like for them to stay home. So there will be pressure to develop, and it's really incumbent on us to make sure, as in our stated goal 1A, that we need to make certain that we're able to develop housing. So just a off-the-cuff statement regarding something that we don't necessarily pay full attention to. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have a couple comments. At first I was a little bit concerned about going to consent calendar for, the recent discussions we've had about, is it code interpretation? Is it state law? What are we affirming? How deep does it go that we're affirming a decision that we haven't had the abilities on some of these more complex ones to actually be as in depth as the hearings official was. And so, but we can always pull stuff from the consent calendar if we have those kind of questions. I don't think I would have pulled anything from today. And all of them were 5-0 votes, so they could have all three been on the consent calendar, the elect to hears. I do feel that we've artificially lowered this fee to the point where I think it's, we're supplementing whoever, whether it's the appellant or the applicant that's coming back on it. We had one today that was an elect not to hear, that it's actually the applicant asking for us not to hear. So it's not always the appellant. It's not about the appellant's access to appeals. So I think the $950 seems a reasonable amount, but it's still not full cost recovery. You've noticed that in here, so we're still doing some subsidizing, but at least we're not subsidizing 3/4, more than 3/4 of the cost. We're only subsidizing, 15, 20%. So, so I really support the option one and referring this to the Finance and Audit Committee to look at it and then give a final recommendation to the board as the next step. So that's my input. Commissioner Sorensen.
I'll just raise a bit of a procedural issue with this, and that is that this was put on our agenda as a discussion item, and then the written materials seem to morph it into, we want a decision from the board about what to do about this. And I kind of focused maybe on the words discussion, direction on fee and lane code changes related to elect not to hear appeals process. So I'm cutting the focus on the discussion rather than the direction. But I get it that you are looking for direction. I guess in terms of the additional data before we could lead to some conclusions on this would be comparison to other communities, because the numbers are kind of small. I mean, there's 350,000 people in the county, and the numbers are all single and double digit numbers. So it looks like to me the recession numbers are going to be lower. and the post-recession numbers are going to be higher. In terms of the board wanting to make sure there was access, that is true, and I guess we're going to have at some point a discussion or a public hearing on whether to change the fees, and if the difference between, you know, $2,000 and $3,000 is significant for some people, they'll probably come in and tell us that. And I'd like to hear what the difference in raising the fees, what it would make. A lot of the people that are appealing these things, they appear to be, you know, groups of people that are get together and they don't like a decision that's being made, and they're a separate group from another group. Now, Landwatch may well be the party that appeals, but it seems like there's different groups that are involved with, like the Oak Ridge quarry, as opposed to some venue, some wedding venue out in the Coast Range. So it seems like there's different groups of people that may be affected by this, and maybe they don't know they'll be affected by it until they want to appeal, and that's another problem in trying to figure out whether, but to get rid of superfluous appeals or appeals that don't have merit, keep in mind, we did lose a couple of these, and that is an important point, that citizens have done a good thing by helping to straighten out the procedures that we're using, and I don't see that represented here. So I'll just say, I don't know if anybody else agrees with me on that, but I'll just say that's my perspective, that we don't jump up and down and say, hey, guess what? Luba just reversed us today. And it doesn't happen that often. But I do think the public does a service for us and for the process to, when they win these things. And we don't seem to have any way of thanking them, or in fact, it's just the opposite, I would say. There's like, well, you're clogging up the system by appealing too much. And I'd be interested in hearing any other alternatives to the idea of creating a barrier, if it does, and if people say it does, create a barrier to access.
Just to weigh in, if I might, Commissioner Sorensen, you mentioned the prospect of a hearing. If fees are changed, it would be done through the lane manual, so just an order. The process, though, I'm trying to think whether we need to spell out anything in Chapter 14 that would mandate a hearing will happen on that, of course, and so we'd have this sort of discussion as part of that. But obviously, the board can have a hearing whenever it wants, and so just keep that in mind if what it is an order to adjust the manual.
So further discussion or direction to staff? So I only heard one of us kind of say they agree with one of the particular sets of directions, and that was myself on the directions that are included under option 1. So I think the staff might need to hear a little bit more from the board as to where to take this. There was a little bit of a request for some additional information, but I didn't know if that precluded moving ahead with moving this to finance and audit, or if this is where you all feel. So I'm kind of looking for a little bit more than just silence here, or discussions about housing.
If I might make a recommendation that staff return with the data that Commissioner Lyken requested in terms of comparison to other counties in terms of what the fees are. I think that would actually be useful data to have in black and white so we could actually see that. We could also go to Finance and Audit with a proposal for the $950 fee beforehand, and then you can always direct us afterwards to go a different way. But I think there is obviously some information that we can bring back to you. I appreciate what you said, Commissioner Sorensen. This is a little bit of a discussion/decision-making, but because we've been before you 3 times to talk about this, we are trying to help hone in on some options, and I think that's what we were trying to do with providing those options is, does the board want to do nothing? And I haven't heard that necessarily, that we just want to keep it at $250, but that you'd like some more information. And you also suggested a comparison to other communities.
Let me ask you this. Do you need more money to process these? Is that what's going on here? Or do you want more money from them so that they won't appeal so much? I'm trying to understand that.
The division is losing money processing appeals in this way. We are primarily fee supported. So our costs are going up and our resources are going down. That's just, now, is it all because of this? Is this the only issue? No. But hour for hour, if we look at compensating staff time, we have to pull from different places to cover the costs of processing the appeals because it's not coming from those fees.
And I agree with what Commissioner Lykin said, is that if we had a comparator with maybe our usual comparator counties, we would gain some insight into how they do it. Maybe we just take the board completely out of it, and then you don't have to make a presentation to the board because the board doesn't make decisions.
Oh, you mean in terms of looking at the other options where the hearings official or in some cases the planning commission can be the final local decision maker? We can provide that. I think that, as legal counsel mentioned, may sort of, there may be a correlation between what the fees are and what the internal processes are for finalizing the decision, the local decision.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, the initial fee within the county is going to be limited at $250. And so if you only have, did I say, appeal is what I meant, appeal fee. If you only have one appeal within the county, it's going to have to be $250 or less. I don't recall what Clackamas County does, for example, whether they have 2 internal appeals or not. I do know that their final decision comes out of their hearings official, not through the board, unless they've changed it since I was there. We talked about that. It does have, lower barriers to entry, as Commissioner Sorensen mentioned. It does give up some strategic advantages in terms of control of the board over how its code is interpreted.
Well, we wouldn't give up the way that we write the code.
Certainly.
And I would think that one of the learning points that should be made here is that, and I believe Commissioner Bozovich has spoken about this, is, putting us in the role of being the lawmaker and writing the code, and then discovering halfway through a land use hearing where we're not in our law-making mode, but we're in our law-applying mode, that, gee, maybe that land use code isn't exactly what we would like it to be. The board in the past has used the interpretation of the code as the way to try to modify the code. And I think it'd just be a lot simpler if we just really put our focus on our law-making function and looking at the code and amending the code and holding hearings on changing the code, rather than trying to do that in the middle of our rule applying, because we're primarily policy makers up here. We're primarily rule makers, not rule appliers. That's what hearings officials are for, in my judgment. And to say to people that are campaigning for public office, gee, I think our land use laws should be strengthened. Gee, I think there should be more flexibility in our land use laws, to me is valid, because then they're going to become decision makers about what that code should say. But to put the elected official in the role of judge, it seems really almost immoral to say, I'm going to be independent, but I just campaigned for public office and got elected because I had a perspective. To me, why don't we just And I think that's the reason some of these other counties and cities have done this is, hey, they want to take their elected officials and put their emphasis on what their code should look like, not spend this excessive amount of time that we spend on law applying. That's a judicial function. We should appoint somebody bright and fair who doesn't have to campaign for elective office and can make the decision based upon the code and the facts in front of them. That would really save a lot of money, seems to me. And it would help us get our code straightened out faster. Because the people that lose those cases, they'll come to us and say, we want the code changed.
I think that's clearly a policy decision for the board, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple of questions. One, whatever the code is, will always be in the position of interpreting it at some level, no matter how the code is written. So there's no argument saying that we will never be interpreting code. And when people campaign, just tell the truth. And if you want to propose something, make sure it's something that's legal to propose when you're campaigning. If not, face the music. I'm looking at some numbers here. Between 2014 and 2016, we had a 300% increase in appeals. And that increase seems to be holding up through 2017. So to me, something has happened that is, I don't think we have that many more questionable decisions being made, the same number of decisions, basically. It's just that there's been a market spike, as you noted. And each appeal costs Lane County taxpayers, Lane County government, money. I mean, that's a rhetorical question. Of course it does, right? Yeah.
I would note that no tax dollars come into Lane County, into our division, but.
Right. But it does cost resources and money and time, and your time, and everybody's time, our time. Consequently, it would seem to me that we need to do something to make certain that we're somehow getting that in some form of check, so that the number of successful appeals we have versus the number of unsuccessful appeals, that the ratio remains fairly close. And Commissioner Sorensen points out that we've had a couple of successful appeals over the last few years. I'm not going to ask you how many, but I don't think it's very, very many in compared to the number of appeals that we have. Consequently, we're spending more resources than we were, maybe 3 times more resources than we were 2 years ago. And we'll spend about the same amount next year or more. So Mr. Chair, I'm with you on option 1. I think as far as the decision making, this is labeled as discussion, but it also says that direction, you're asking for direction. And that's what these options are, directions, not decisions, just directions for y'all. So I'm in favor of option 1, direct staff to establish a revised appeal review procedure to be codified as component of Lane County Chapter 14 code updates. Okay, I'm with you on that one, Commissioner Bozich.
As am I.
Commissioner Williams, you want to adjust the mic so we can hear that?
Well, there are a couple things that appeal to me. One, comps are good. I think those are important, get a sense of where we're at. I like the idea about the consent agenda as well, for reasons stated previous. So with that, thank you.
So I'm hearing at least a majority that are recommending that you move ahead with option 1. And in addition to gaining some of that extra data, I think is important. I think maybe a future discussion about whether we want to maintain the board's role in this appeal process, I think has serious merit. But this wasn't really started out as should the board be hearing these at all. It was just about what the fees for it, and we haven't really fleshed that out. But both Pete and I do share that odd feeling when we sit up here ruling on code that we've written. Most of it was written long before I got here, but still code that was written by the board. And losing that little bit of deference we get out of LUBA, is it worth that issue? And would that save your division a whole lot of time? Would it save developers a whole lot of time? Because like today, we had 2 out of 3 of our appeals were actually the applicant appealing a denial or a decision they didn't like, the case where they wanted 2 lots and they only got 1 legal lot. So that's really, it's not always about access for watchdog groups. And so the question is, would it just make the process faster, better, and maybe we lose a little bit of deference, but is the trade-off? And looking at the 2 counties that are ahead of us in the comparables, Washington and Clackamas seem to have gone to that mode. So that's worth taking a look at. But that, to me, seems like a separate decision process than just purely looking at the fee for what we're currently doing, which is what we've been talking about now 3rd time. So I don't want to get distracted by a new issue. But I do think I'm going to park that issue, and maybe we'll have it come up later for the board to talk about.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that issue is outside of option 1. Option 1 seems to continue with the status quo as far as the board's role. And for anybody watching, option 1 has 4 bullet points under it. All of that is incorporated in the head nods that you just saw, and that can be reviewed on today's agenda. Click on View Items, and you can see all the bullet points beneath that.
So any further discussion on that item? Do you feel you have clear direction now?
Yeah, we'll take it to Finance and Audit, and then we'll come back before you. And as Mr. Clark noted, this will also require change to Chapter 14, which fortuitously we are in the middle of doing, so we can have that discussion as part of the public hearing as well.
Great.
And I suspect that may require at this point for us to push out an extra hearing on that, but that would probably happen anyway, I suspect, so.
Thank you very much.
They seem to take twice, yeah. Thank you very much. So that brings us back to an item that we pushed off of this morning's agenda, which is the action for the letter to the LRAPA board requesting reconsideration of the Title 47 open burning rules making decision. And this was an item I asked the board head nods to draft the letter and to bring before you. And we did get a little bit of public comment from one of the LRAPA board members, and I appreciate his suggestion to not have the wording he asked for, which was to remove the reference to ignoring our input. I can't quite do that because it wasn't necessarily the LRAPA board that ignored our input, as much as it was how staff presented the decision choice to the board. When Springfield provided input, they did not offer options that were outside of what Springfield's input was to the board. They basically closed the door on changes inside for open burning inside the Springfield UGB, because that was the recommendation from the Springfield City Council. Whereas we made some draft recommendation, and what they got presented was our recommendation and 4 others. That's not similar treatment, which was part of what I was concerned about, was that and on top of that, technically Springfield doesn't have jurisdiction of their UGB for open burning. Lane County does. So I know we had some input about that, but I think I did run the draft of this letter by multiple people. It's been passed legal counsel. Devin's looked it over, trying to make sure it's not inflammatory or anything. We're just asking for reconsideration of the decision so we can, particularly the fact that less than a majority of the board approved that decision. They had absentees that day, and it was, even though it was a majority of those present, it was a minority of the total board. So it'd be great to have it reconsidered and looked at and maybe heard by the entire board or decided on by the entire board. So that's my request, is to get a motion and an approval to send this letter on behalf of the board. Commissioner Farr.
Sure, I'm in support of this for the 2 reasons you just stated. One, it's a request for reconsideration, and the second is that it was not a majority of the board that was present for the decision that was made. So it seems reasonable, seems a well-worded letter, and I'm ready to vote yes on that.
Commissioner-
I'm just going to speak up and say that my understanding is the reason that the El Rapa board passed it was to try to protect the air quality in the Eugene, Springfield area. And I don't think we need to send them letters about that, but obviously you do, so I think we should have a vote on sending the letter.
Yeah. And we'll need one, so. Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, the piece that jumps out at me here is that those folks that took the vote are appointees from municipalities and making decisions for folks in the urban growth boundary, and that disturbs me. So I support the letter.
Pat.
Just one last, this letter does not preclude El Rapa protecting the air quality in Lane County or in the Eugene Springfield metropolitan area. It does not do that. There's nothing in here that does that. It's just a reconsideration based upon the fact that there was not a majority present. They'll still have the same charge. Commissioner Bozevich, I think you've been our representative for at least 5 years now, with a brief period that I took over, but at least 5 years, probably longer than that. And I certainly trust your interpretation and your request to have their board reconsider. So once again, I don't think their charge has changed. This letter doesn't change their charge or ask them to change their charge.
No. Thank you. So with any further discussion about the letter? If not, I'll entertain a motion. Commissioner Lykin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move approval of the letter to El Rapa Board requesting reconsideration of Title 47, Open Burning Rules, decision-making.
Second?
It's been moved by Commissioner Lykin, seconded by Commissioner Williams to approve the letter to El Rapa. Any discussion of the motion? Commissioner Lykin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciated Mr. Carpenter's remarks during public comment. I've actually known Bill for a long time, member of our Planning Commission, whom I have a lot of respect for, and I appreciated his comments, but I feel like that all we're asking for is a reconsideration, and that's really what the ask is. And based on the information that Chair Bozevich cited, and so I don't think this is really that, it's not troubling to me really at all, because it actually makes sense. It's a request from the person who represents the Lane County Board of Commissioners on the El Rapa board asking for this, and I'm more than happy to vote in the affirmative on that request. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further discussion to the motion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
No.
Motion passes 4-1 with Commissioner Sorensen in dissent. So that gets us down to, I think, review of assignments, because I think we covered the rest of board business. So
Unless you want to go back to agenda team requests, Commissioner Bozevich?
I think we went through that before lunch, but if you have a new one, I'll entertain that.
I do, actually, yes. So.
Okay. So then let's go back to item 9C, which is agenda team requests.
Thank you. And this, Ms. Mooker, actually, this may not be a direct request from me at this point in time, but after the HRSA review team made their final presentation to the staff of our health department, I was present. I was present throughout the review at various points. I talked with Ms. Gaffney about the potential of having a presentation to the Board of County Commissioners, or more preferably probably the Board of Health, regarding HRSA's findings from last week's review. And I'm not sure if Ms. Gaffney has approached you or will approach you about it, but at some point in the future, this is not, Mr. Chair, not a direct agenda team request at this point in time, but probably a signal that this is going to come down the road. Because in the words of one of the HRSA reviewers, Ileana Ponce Gonzalez, what you're doing in Lane County, the world needs to hear about. Quote, end quote. Thank you.
Well, I would support that coming back to us maybe as a report back from Health and Human Services to the Board of Health. So maybe we'll have a discussion during agenda team. And I'm seeing more than 3 head nods on the board. So.
And Karen did discuss that with me, I want to say last week. Yeah.
Great. It's always great when we hear from national accreditation folks. understand where we rank nationally.
90 or 91 out of 92 is not a bad number. So,
Almost perfect. So any other agenda team requests before we move on to review of assignments? Now,
So I just have three here. The first was, I heard support for Mayor Coey's request to bring forward a discussion about county access roads being used by side-by-sides. And I heard a desire to look really countywide at all county access roads as opposed to limiting them to some, so we can begin that work at the staff level. Second item was a request from Commissioner Williams to pursue a state legislative fix to the land use issues related to that Agrarian Ales and other breweries potentially could be facing. So we'll add that one to our legislative docket. And then the third item was Commissioner Bozievich request to develop a policy on commissioner travel regarding funding and how those requests come forward, and to first take that to Policies and Procedures Committee. Is that right? But you wanted staff to develop a draft
recommendation to them, yeah.
recommendation to Policies and Procedures.
Yeah.
So those are the three that I had.
Were there any other assignments that got missed?
On the travel, I'll just mention that when I was in the Senate during two different Senate presidencies, and under Senate President Bradbury, the money for travel was administered by the Senate president. And the senators had to go to Senator Bradbury and say, I want to go to this meeting and I want, $1,000 to go to this meeting. Will you give it to me? And some of the minority members noticed that their travel plans were deemed too expensive, but that the Senate president was able to achieve all of his goals in travel. So it came as quite a shock when Gordon Smith became the Senate president that a decision was made really quickly, maybe the first week of the Senate term, that the entire travel budget of the previous year would be divided by 30. And so you could use your own travel budget and travel to the extent that was 1/30 of the total. And if you wanted to do something more extreme, you could go to the non-traveling senators and get them to put some into your account. But there was no real problem with the fairness because they just made it. Now, Commissioner Stewart and I were on a committee that modified our rule to whatever it is now. And I would just think going back to the straight 20% rule would be the simplest, but that's just by way of, for the group that's going to take this on to be aware that.
The one place that kind of falls down is when there's certain positions that are required to travel, like the past chair that has to go to DC for the United Front, the way we've arranged it now. So they use up most of their 1/5 doing a mandatory trip. That's where I think we need to kind of juggle that a little bit. Maybe there's a way to split up a portion of it and keep a certain amount set aside for that travel on behalf of the entire board. So I'll leave that up to Policies and Procedures at this point, but I appreciate the story because it does demonstrate how difficult travel budgets are. So is there any other business for the board today? Seeing and hearing none, we are adjourned.
Give